He walked out of her hospital room while the heart monitor was still beeping. Not to get help, not to find the doctor, not even to get coffee from the machine down the hall. He walked out to answer her phone
Tell
call,
them the merger is still
straightened
on
his
schedule.
jacket, and never came back.
Yes, everything is
That
under
same
control
night,
here.
while Eleanor lay alone in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a nurse who kept returning with softer and softer eyes, her husband
it's
Marcus
done.
was boarding a
believe you have
private
the
jet with
copies.
his billionaire boss. Champagne already poured, ring already off. He thought he had made the smartest trade of his life. He had absolutely no idea, because the woman he left behind in that hospital bed was not who he thought she was. She had never been who he thought she was. And in the silence of that hospital room, in the precise and patient way that only a woman who has been underestimated her entire life can do, Eleanor Callahan began to decide exactly what happened next. He thought he was choosing power. He had just handed it to her. What she did next, he never saw coming. And neither will you. Lesson statement. This is a story about what happens when a woman stops protecting a man who never deserved her patience and starts protecting herself instead. Whatever you are holding on to out of loyalty right now, this story will make you ask whether it deserves you. If you are still here after that first minute, you already know this story is going to stay with you. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like Eleanor's. Leave a comment below and tell us, would you have done what she did, or would you have walked away sooner? And if you know someone who needs to hear that quiet strength is still strength, share this with them right now. Every like tells us to keep finding stories worth telling. Stay with Eleanor. She is just getting started.
She was lying in a hospital bed with a heart monitor beeping beside her when her husband walked out. Not to get coffee, not to call the doctor, not to find the nurse and ask what happened next. He walked out to answer a phone call, straightened his jacket in the reflection of the sliding glass doors, and never came back. That night, while Eleanor Callahan lay alone in a sterile room with an IV in her arm and a nurse who kept checking on her with eyes full of quiet apology, her husband Marcus was boarding a private jet at a regional airport 40 miles away. The woman waiting at the top of the jet stairs was his boss. The champagne was already poured. What Marcus Callahan did not know, had never known, had never thought to ask about, was this. The woman he left behind in that hospital bed was not the quiet, modest, nonprofit director he had married 7 years ago. She was the sole heir to a privately held fortune worth $500 million, structured across trusts, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios in 4 states. All of it protected under a confidentiality agreement she had signed the week her father died. He thought he was trading up. He had no idea what he was walking away from, and he had even less idea what she was about to do next. This is not a story about a woman who was destroyed by betrayal. It is a story about what a woman builds when she finally stops protecting a man who never deserved her patience. It is a story about quiet power, about the difference between softness and strength, and about the very specific kind of justice that arrives not with noise, but with paperwork. If you have ever loved someone who took your patience for weakness, this story is for you. Stay with Eleanor Callahan. You will want to see how this ends. The blueberries were fresh. That was the first sign something was wrong. Eleanor Callahan only bought fresh blueberries for the good pancakes, and she only made the good pancakes when she needed to remind herself that her marriage was worth fighting for. Her best friend Diane had pointed this out exactly 4 times over the past 2 years, each time with the same arched eyebrow and the same carefully neutral expression that meant she had opinions she was choosing not to share. It was a Sunday in late October. The Connecticut morning was gray and soft, the kind of morning that made the inside of the house feel particularly warm, and Eleanor had been up since 6, moving quietly through the kitchen in her father's old flannel shirt and bare feet, measuring flour and folding batter with the focused attention she gave to everything she cared about. The house was modest by design. 3 bedrooms in a good neighborhood in Westport, a small yard that backed up against a walking trail, a kitchen she had renovated herself over 2 weekends with Diane providing moral support and questionable advice about tile grout. It was exactly the kind of house where a woman who ran a children's art foundation on grant funding would live. Comfortable, careful. Nothing about it suggested anything other than what it appeared to be. That was also by design. Diane arrived at 8:15 with coffee from the place on the corner and immediately spotted the fresh blueberries on the counter. She set the coffees down slowly. "You made the good pancakes," she said. Eleanor kept her eyes on the batter. "I felt like doing something nice." Eleanor Margaret Callahan. Diane pulled out a kitchen stool and sat down. "You only make the good pancakes when something is wrong. We have established this. We have discussed this on multiple occasions." "Everything is fine." "The blueberries are fresh. They are never fresh unless you are worried." Eleanor finally looked up. She was 34 years old, with dark blonde hair she kept in a low ponytail most days, and gray eyes that people often described as calm, which was accurate and also occasionally misleading. She was calm the way deep water is calm. The surface gives very little information about what is happening underneath. "He's been working late," she said simply. "A lot. Marcus has always worked late. This is different." Diane wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and said nothing. Because Diane was smart enough to know when Eleanor was working her way toward something and when pushing would make her stop entirely. Eleanor poured the first round of batter onto the griddle, the kitchen filled with the smell of butter and warm sugar. "She calls him on weekends," Eleanor said. "Victoria Weston, his boss. She calls him on Sunday mornings." "What does he say when she calls?" "He says it's work." "And you believe him?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The pancakes sizzled gently. "I believe he believes it's work," she said finally. The front door opened. Marcus Callahan came in from the garage, looking like a man who had been awake for several hours and had recently made decisions he was not entirely comfortable with. He was 37, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being told he was exceptional at a young age and never having had significant reason to doubt it. He was, by most observable measures, a good-looking man with excellent professional instincts and a growing blind spot, roughly the shape and size of his own ambition. He saw the pancakes. He saw Diane. He checked his watch. "Smells good," he said, with the distracted warmth of a man who had already moved on to the next thing. "I can't stay, though. Victoria needs the quarterly projections by noon. Hargrove Acquisition is closing Friday." "It is Sunday," Diane said pleasantly. "Yeah, I know." He kissed Eleanor on the top of her head. The gesture had the quality of habit rather than affection. The way you touch a doorframe when you walk past it. "Don't wait up tonight, okay? It's going to be a long one." He was gone in 4 minutes. Eleanor stood at the griddle and listened to his car back out of the driveway. Diane looked at the stack of perfect pancakes on the counter. "He didn't eat any," she said. "No," said Eleanor, "he didn't." Later that morning, after Diane had gone and the kitchen was clean and the leftover pancakes were wrapped in the refrigerator, Eleanor went to her father's study. The room was exactly as he had left it when he died 3 years ago, because she had not been able to bring herself to change it, and also because the safe behind the bookshelf contained documents that required the room to remain exactly this private. She opened the bottom drawer of the old oak desk. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and secured with a single rubber band, was a sealed envelope stamped with the letterhead of Whitfield and Associates. She did not open it. She had not opened it since the day Robert Whitfield had handed it to her across his mahogany desk and explained, in the careful and precise language of a man who had spent 40 years protecting other people's interests. What her father had built and why he had chosen to build it the way he had. James Callahan had spent his career in quiet acquisition. He had purchased failing companies, restructured them, and sold them at a profit, and then reinvested those profits with a patience that most of his competitors found baffling. He had never appeared on a list. He had never given an interview. He had driven the same truck for 11 years and coached Eleanor's soccer team when she was 9, and made his own coffee every morning, and was, by every external measure, a man of comfortable but unremarkable means. He had left Eleanor $500 million. He had also left her a letter, which she had read twice and then placed back in the envelope, because reading it more than that felt like something she was not yet ready for. The letter said, "Keep this private until your heart tells you the truth about the man you married. Love is truest when money cannot touch it. If the money needs to come out, then the love was never real. And if the love was real, the money will only ever be a gift." Eleanor touched the envelope through the brown paper, put the drawer back. She thought about the way Marcus had kissed the top of her head without looking at her. She thought about the Sunday mornings when he used to make her coffee first, before his own. She thought about how long ago that had been. She closed the drawer and went back to work. The offices of Weston Industries occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and everything about them was designed to communicate a single message. Power is not given, it is constructed. Victoria Weston had constructed hers over 22 years, starting with a data management firm she had built in a 1-bedroom apartment in Boston at the age of 23, using a personal loan and an almost pathological refusal to accept that anything was impossible. She was now 45, and the company she had grown from that initial firm processed financial data for clients across 6 countries and employed 900 people. She was also, by the assessment of everyone who had worked closely with her, one of the most demanding and perceptive people in any room she entered. Marcus had started at Weston Industries 18 months ago, hired as a senior marketing director. He had, within 6 months, caught Victoria's attention in the way that ambitious people catch the attention of other ambitious people, which is to say, she recognized in him a hunger that matched her own and decided it was useful. What she had not fully accounted for was the difference between hunger and integrity. On the Tuesday after the Sunday pancakes, Marcus was in Victoria's office at 8:47 in the evening. His tie was loosened. The city glittered 40 floors below. Victoria stood at the window with 2 glasses of wine, one of which she handed to him with the easy familiarity of someone who had decided that professional boundaries were negotiable when the stakes were high enough. "The Hargrove acquisition closes Friday," she said. "After that, I want you to move into the executive partner role we discussed." Marcus accepted the wine. "I thought that was still under consideration." "I've considered it." She turned to look at him directly. "You have good instincts, Marcus. You see opportunities before other people recognize them as opportunities. That is a specific skill, and it is rarer than you think. I appreciate that. I'm not complimenting you for the sake of it. I'm telling you because the partner role comes with access to everything: acquisition strategy, client portfolio management, the financial architecture of the whole operation." She sipped her wine. "It also comes with a level of trust that I extend to very few people." Marcus met her eyes. The air between them had the specific quality that exists when 2 people are deciding, separately, how much they want to acknowledge what is happening. "What kind of trust?" he asked. Victoria set her glass down on the window ledge. "The kind where what happens in this office stays in this office, where what we build together is protected, where loyalty runs in both directions. His phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't look at it. "I can do that," he said. Victoria smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed a calculation. "Good," she said. "Then let's talk about the Hargrove financial structure." What neither of them said out loud, and what Marcus would spend a significant amount of time later pretending had not been a deliberate choice, was that the financial structure they discussed that evening involved routing certain Hargrove acquisition funds through a private LLC that Marcus had registered 6 months earlier in his own name, using an address in Stamford, Connecticut, and a co-signatory named Greg Paulson. Marcus had told himself it was a temporary arrangement, a bridge strategy, a way of managing risk that existed in a gray area of financial compliance that sufficiently motivated lawyers could argue either way. He had told himself a great many things. At 11:15 that night, Eleanor heard his car in the driveway. She was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a grant proposal for the foundation spread in front of her, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. Marcus came in, smelling of expensive restaurant and wine, and the particular combination of someone else's perfume and someone else's decisions. He said it had been a long meeting. He said he was exhausted. He said the investors were difficult. Eleanor said she was glad he was home. She watched him walk to the bedroom. She sat with her cold tea for another 40 minutes. On the kitchen counter, his phone lit up with a message from a contact saved as V.W. Eleanor did not pick it up, but she could see the first line of the message in the notification preview. It said, "Don't forget. No ring tomorrow. Sends the wrong message." Eleanor set down her tea very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you do not want to break anything. She sat at the table until 2 in the morning. She did not cry. She did not confront him. She did not open the envelope in the study drawer. She sat and thought with the focused, patient precision that people who have been managing quiet knowledge for a long time are very good at. Then she went to bed. She would have one more week of ordinary life before everything fell apart at once. It started with the laptop. Marcus used the shared family computer occasionally, usually for personal banking or travel bookings, and he was, in the way of men who have never considered that their private correspondence might be visible to anyone else, occasionally careless about logging out. Eleanor had not been looking for anything. She had been updating the Foundation's grant calendar on a Wednesday evening, home alone, the television on low in the background, a glass of red wine on the desk that she had been intending to drink for an hour without actually drinking. She opened the browser and found herself looking at Marcus's email. She almost closed it. She had a moment, a genuine moment, where she told herself to close the browser and pour the wine and go watch something mindless and let the week continue. She did not close the browser. What she found in the next 40 minutes was not what she expected, partly because she had been preparing herself for evidence of an emotional affair, for personal messages and late-night confessions, for the specific kind of betrayal that is painful but comprehensible. What she found instead was a financial architecture. Emails between Marcus and Greg Paulson about the LLC, emails between Marcus and a man named Alan Mercer, who appeared to be a mid-level accountant at one of Weston Industries' data partner firms, discussing the routing of client funds through the Shell account, forwarded documents with authorization signatures, transaction confirmations, a paper trail that was not hidden so much as it was filed in the ordinary folders of a man who had never imagined anyone would look. Between those emails, almost worse because they were so casual, were the personal messages, not explicit, not even particularly romantic, just the specific texture of intimacy between two people who had stopped pretending they were only colleagues, references to dinners and private jokes, and a trip to Chicago that Eleanor now understood had not involved any investors at all. The room tilted. Eleanor gripped the edge of the desk. The pain in her chest came fast and sharp, and she recognized it distantly as something physical, something her body was doing in response to information her mind had not yet fully processed. And then the recognition became irrelevant because she was on the kitchen floor and her phone was somewhere nearby and she could not quite remember how to use it. The neighbor found her 20 minutes later. Carol Hammond, from 3 doors down, who had come over to return a borrowed casserole dish and had found the front door unlocked and Eleanor on the kitchen floor, pale and barely conscious. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. Marcus was called. He came to the hospital looking genuinely frightened, and Eleanor, drifting in and out on the gurney, saw his face and thought, "He does still love me somewhere in there. He is just also capable of loving other things more." He held her hand in the emergency bay. He said all the right things. He said, "I am not going anywhere." The doctor pulled him aside and used the words acute stress response and overnight observation and no excitement of any kind. The nurse, a young woman named Carol, who was not the same Carol as the neighbor, showed him to the waiting area and told him that his wife needed rest. He sat in the waiting area for 31 minutes. His phone buzzed 4 times. On the 5th buzz, he looked at it. The message was from Victoria. "Private hangar. Hargrove closes in 12 hours. I need you here. This is everything we built. Do not make me do this alone." Marcus looked at the door to the ER bay. He looked at his phone. He looked at the door. He stood up, smoothed his jacket, and told the nurse at the desk that he needed to step out for a moment and would be right back. The automatic doors slid open. He walked through them. They closed behind him. Eleanor, in the hospital bed with the monitor beeping a steady rhythm beside her, did not know he was gone for another 2 hours. The nurse Carol checked on her at midnight and at 1 in the morning, and both times Eleanor asked if Marcus had called, and both times Carol's careful non-answer told Eleanor everything she needed to know. She lay in the dark hospital room and understood something she had been avoiding understanding for a long time. She also, in that same dark room, made a decision. Not about revenge. Not about anger, though the anger was there, banked and steady like coals rather than flame. She made a decision about what came next. At 7 the following morning, she called Robert Whitfield. He answered on the second ring. "Eleanor," he said, his voice had the quality of a man who has been waiting for this call for some time. "Tell me what happened." She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had always valued most about Robert Whitfield. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "Are the inheritance documents still secured?" he asked. "Yes." "Have you told anyone?" "No." Another silence. Then, "I'll pick you up at 9. Robert Whitfield drove a gray sedan that was 12 years old and meticulously maintained, which Eleanor had always thought was a perfect expression of his character. He arrived at the hospital at 9:15, signed whatever paperwork was needed, and walked Eleanor out into the cold morning air without comment or ceremony. They drove in silence for several minutes. "The hospital wanted to keep you longer," he said finally. "I know. You should have let them." "I needed to go home." He glanced at her briefly. Robert was 58 years old, silver-haired, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people across legal documents and had developed very accurate instincts about what people were actually saying versus what they were saying out loud. "What do you expect to find?" he asked. Eleanor looked out the window at the Connecticut morning. Gray sky, yellow leaves, The ordinary world continuing its ordinary business. I expect to find that he's already filed, she said. Robert said nothing. She was right. The divorce petition was on the dining table. Neat, organized, paper-clipped. Marcus J. Callahan, petitioner. Eleanor M. Callahan, respondent. His signature at the bottom, in the blue ink of the good pen she had given him for Christmas 2 years ago. His wedding ring was on top of the papers. Not even a note. Eleanor stood at the table for a long time. She picked up his ring. It was a plain gold band, simple, the one she had chosen, because he had said he didn't like things that were flashy. She turned it over in her fingers, then she set it back on the papers. Walked to the study, opened the safe, and took out the brown envelope. She sat at her father's desk and opened it for the third time in 3 years. The documents were exactly as she remembered. Trust accounts, real estate holdings, stock portfolios, the corporate structure Robert had built to manage it all. $512 million, give or take the past quarter's returns, all of it held quietly under the name James Callahan Legacy Trust, with Eleanor as sole beneficiary and Robert as trustee. She read through everything carefully. She took notes on a legal pad, the same yellow legal pads her father had used, which she had bought in bulk after he died because the specific yellow of them felt like a form of continuity. Then she called Robert back in from the hallway, where he had been waiting with the patient dignity of a man who understood that some moments require privacy. "Tell me," she said, "what I can legally do with this." Robert sat down across from her. He took his glasses from his breast pocket and put them on. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was professional, and also, underneath the professionalism, something that might have been pride. "I want to show you something first," he said. He opened his briefcase and placed a printed report on the desk between them. "I had our financial analysts run a preliminary review of Weston Industries' partner network last month. I began this when you called me in September and told me about the text message." Eleanor looked at him. "I have been your father's attorney for 31 years, he said simply. "I pay attention." The report identified 3 mid-level data management firms that processed compliance documents for Weston Industries. All 3 had regulatory structures that were, in Robert's carefully chosen language, imprecise. 2 of them had employees who had contacted external attorneys in the past year about concerns they were afraid to raise internally. "These 3 companies," Robert said, "are currently available for acquisition. Their valuations are modest. Combined, purchasing controlling interest would cost approximately $40 million and could be completed within 60 days through proper channels." Eleanor looked at the report. "If ECH Holdings were to acquire these firms," Robert continued, "the new ownership would have full legal right to conduct an internal audit of all financial operations, including historical transaction records, communications, and authorization documents." "ECH Holdings," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Callahan Holdings, if you choose to incorporate. Anonymous parent company, legally registered, fully compliant, nothing traces to your name." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "And if those audits found evidence of financial misconduct?" "Then, that evidence, obtained through legitimate business ownership, would be admissible in any civil or criminal proceeding." She looked at her father's portrait on the wall, his familiar, steady expression looking back at her. "He would have done exactly this," she said softly. "Yeah," said Robert, "he would have." Eleanor picked up her pen. "Let's build it," she said. The next 6 weeks were the most productive of Eleanor's life. From the outside, nothing had changed. She continued driving her 5-year-old Subaru to the foundation every morning. She continued supervising the children's art programs, helping 10-year-olds mix colors and telling 11-year-olds that perspective was something you practiced, not something you were born with. She continued responding to Marcus's brief and increasingly formal text messages about the divorce proceedings, timing, and the division of their shared property. She did not contest the settlement he had proposed. The house, the car, $40,000. She agreed to all of it without a counteroffer, which confused his lawyer and, she suspected, confused Marcus, who had been prepared for a fight and found instead a woman who appeared to have accepted the situation with a composure he could not quite interpret. He did not know about ECH Holdings. He did not know about the auditors Robert had placed inside all three newly acquired data firms. He did not know about Alan Mercer, the mid-level accountant at the largest of the three firms, who had been waiting for almost 8 months for someone safe to tell. He did not know about any of it because Eleanor was her father's daughter, and her father had understood that the most powerful position in any situation is the one that nobody knows you hold. Diane knew some of it. Eleanor had told her enough to explain the new activities, the late nights at the study, the legal calls, the careful way she was managing her energy. Diane's response had been characteristic. "Can I help? You can bring coffee. Done? Also, for what it is worth, I have always thought Marcus was slightly too comfortable with his own opinions, and this situation confirms it. You liked Marcus. I liked who you were when you were with him in the first years. I was tolerating Marcus, specifically for your sake. There is a difference." Grandpa Thomas Callahan appeared at Eleanor's door on a Saturday morning in mid-November with a lasagna and an expression of profound personal embarrassment. He was 78 years old, Marcus's paternal grandfather, and he was, in Eleanor's assessment, genuinely one of the best people she had ever met. He had learned about the divorce from his sister, who had learned about it from someone at her church, which was how information traveled in Connecticut. "I heard my grandson is an idiot," Grandpa Thomas said, holding the lasagna. "I brought food. I am sorry about him. He gets it from his father's side. His father also made terrible decisions about women. I want you to know that I personally have always had excellent judgment about women, which Marcus unfortunately did not inherit." Eleanor let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and ate a slice of the lasagna himself and talked about Marcus's father and the time Marcus's father had also made a catastrophically poor decision that Grandpa Thomas had predicted and warned against and been ignored about, and his presence was so comfortable and so genuinely fond that Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time in weeks. "You're a good woman," Grandpa Thomas said as he left. Whatever he told himself to justify this, he was wrong. "Thank you, Thomas. Also, the lasagna has Italian sausage, not pork. I remembered you prefer Italian sausage." He had remembered that for 7 years. Marcus had stopped noticing what she preferred approximately 4 years ago. She stood at the door and watched him walk to his car and thought about the specific arithmetic of love, how the small things accumulate into either a foundation or a deficit, and how a man who forgets what you prefer is rarely forgetting only that. 3 days later, Robert called. "The auditors found it," he said. "The shell account, transaction records, authorization chains, the routing structure, all of it, clean, documented, and directly tied to Weston Industries' client portfolios. It is corporate fraud, Eleanor. Clear and prosecutable." Eleanor sat down slowly. "How confident are you?" "Completely. We also have Alan Mercer. He has been keeping personal records for 8 months. Audio recordings on his personal device, digital copies of authorization emails, a handwritten log of every transaction he was asked to process. He is, if I am being direct, the most thorough, reluctant whistleblower I have encountered in 30 years of practice. Is he safe? He is now. The moment ECH Holdings acquired his firm, he had new ownership with legal obligation to protect him as a company asset. File with the SEC, Eleanor said, already drafting the submission. She hung up the phone and sat in the quiet study for a long moment. She allowed herself, for the first time since the hospital, to feel something close to relief. The case was built. The evidence was clean. Marcus's choices had consequences that were now, with the appropriate legal documentation, inevitable. She called Diane. "It's done," she said. "We have everything." "Oh my God," Diane said. "Are we celebrating?" "Please say we are celebrating. I have been waiting for this moment. I have a very good bottle of wine that I have been saving specifically for this occasion." "Not yet," Eleanor said. "But soon." She was smiling when she hung up. Her phone rang 30 seconds later. "Unknown number." She answered. Silence. And then a woman's voice, calm and controlled, and completely unmistakable. "Eleanor," said Victoria Weston, "we need to talk." The coffee shop was neutral territory. Victoria Weston arrived 3 minutes early, which Eleanor suspected was deliberate, and chose a table in the back corner with sight lines to both entrances, which Eleanor was certain was deliberate. She was not wearing the corporate armor Eleanor associated with her. No power suit, no statement jewelry, a gray coat, dark jeans, hair down rather than in its usual controlled arrangement. She looked like a woman who had recently reconsidered several things. Eleanor sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I'll assume," Victoria said finally, "that you are the anonymous party that acquired controlling interest in 3 of my partner firms over the past 6 weeks." Eleanor said nothing. "It was elegant," Victoria said. "Honestly, your father would have appreciated it." Eleanor went very still. "You knew my father." "James Callahan." A brief, unreadable expression crossed Victoria's face. "We competed on 3 acquisitions in 1997, 1999, and 2001. He beat me on all 3. I was furious each time and then, eventually, impressed. He was the most patient strategist I ever encountered. He never mentioned you. No, he wouldn't have. He didn't discuss business at home." She paused. "Neither, apparently, do you." Eleanor waited. Victoria placed both hands flat on the table. It was a deliberate gesture. Open, nothing hidden. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to believe that I'm telling you because it is true, not because it serves me, although I will acknowledge that it also serves me." "Go ahead." "The largest transfer, the one your auditors found, the final routing through the shell account that completes the fraud case." Victoria held her gaze. "Marcus acted without my authorization. I approved earlier structural changes based on documents I believed were standard compliance filings. The final transfer, the one that actually constitutes criminal fraud, was executed under a document bearing my signature." "Your signature. A forged version of my signature." Her jaw tightened. "I discovered this 3 days ago when my own legal team was reviewing the SEC filing that your attorney submitted. I found a document I had never seen before, bearing my name, authorizing a transfer I was never told about." Eleanor studied her face. "He forged your signature, yes. And you are telling me this because if this goes to trial, I will testify against him, but I need something from you first." Victoria met her eyes directly. "ECH Holdings currently has controlling interest in 3 of my partner firms. 300 people work across those organizations. They had nothing to do with Marcus's choices. I am asking you to consider their position before deciding what to do with those acquisitions. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the Children's Art Foundation, about the 18 kids in the summer program, about what it felt like to have innocent people affected by choices they had no part in making. "I will think about it," she said. Victoria nodded once. She began to stand, then paused. "He told me you were soft," she said, "that you were too gentle for the kind of life he wanted, that you would never fight back." She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was complicated and honest. "I believed him, which is the thing I am most embarrassed about. I am generally a better judge of people." Eleanor looked back at her steadily. "He confused softness with patience," she said. "A lot of people make that mistake." Victoria buttoned her coat. "Yes," she said quietly. "They do." She left. Eleanor sat alone with her coffee, which had gone cold, and thought about the difference between an enemy and a person who made bad choices and now had to live with them. She also thought about the 300 people who went to work every day in buildings they did not own, making decisions they were not consulted about, and whose lives could be altered by a sequence of events that had nothing to do with them. She thought about her father, who had spent his entire career acquiring companies without the people. Inside them, ever feeling the ground shift beneath their feet. She called Robert. "The partner firms," she said. "I want to retain them. Clean management, protected employment. We do not dismantle anything that was built by people who behaved ethically." "That was already my recommendation," Robert said. "I know," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." The first disaster arrived on a Thursday morning. A financial news blog published a story with the headline, "Mystery Buyer, Targeting Weston Industries Partners, Hostile Takeover Incoming." The story was thin on specifics, but accurate enough in its broad outlines to cause immediate damage. Weston Industries stock dropped 4% before noon. Two of the three partner firms froze their internal cooperation with ECH Holdings audit teams, pending review of the ownership situation. The third firm's legal counsel sent a letter requesting clarification of ECH Holdings' intentions. Most critically, the SEC notified Robert that the timeline for the fraud case review had been pushed back 60 days, pending clarification of ECH Holdings' acquisition methods. 60 days. Robert called Eleanor with the news. She sat at her kitchen table and processed it. "Someone talked," she said. "Someone in my office, I believe. I am addressing it." 60 days. "Yes." She thanked him and ended the call and sat quietly for a few minutes. Then the second disaster arrived. The Connecticut State Arts Council called at 2 in the afternoon. An anonymous complaint had been filed alleging financial mismanagement at the Harris Art and Hope Foundation. The complaint claimed that grant funds had been misappropriated for personal use. The allegation was entirely false. It was also, as Eleanor recognized immediately, precisely calibrated to cause maximum damage. The investigation would require a full account freeze for the foundation pending review. The summer program, 18 children registered, activities planned, materials purchased, had to be suspended immediately. Eleanor drove to the foundation and sat in the empty studio. Paint-covered tables, small chairs, a bulletin board covered in children's artwork she had been planning to feature at the end-of-year exhibition. She sat there for a long time. The loss of the marriage had been painful. The loss of the hospital night had been painful. But these empty, small chairs, felt like something different, something more personal than any of it. She was sitting there when Diane came in. Diane took one look at her face and sat down in one of the small chairs, which was clearly not designed for an adult. and which she occupied with the determined discomfort of someone who has decided that comfort is irrelevant to the present situation. He went after the foundation, Eleanor said. I know. The kids. I know. He knows I would trade everything else to protect this place. Diane was quiet for a moment. He is afraid, she said. People do their most specific damage when they are afraid. Eleanor stood up. Get Robert on the phone, she said. The third disaster arrived that evening on the 6 o'clock news. Marcus had given an interview. He was in a good suit, in a clean office that was not his, looking composed and sympathetic. He did not mention Eleanor by name. He spoke about a difficult marriage, about growing apart, about the sadness of realizing you had outgrown a relationship. He used the phrase hidden things with a careful vagueness that was clearly designed to imply more than it stated. He also, in the interview's final segment, mentioned with practiced regret that his wife ran a nonprofit that had recently come under review. Diane watched the screen with an expression of absolute cold fury. He just did that on television, she said. Yes, said Eleanor. He is on television, looking sad about it. Yes. Eleanor. I know. Diane turned to look at her. Eleanor was not crying. She was not visibly angry. She was sitting perfectly still, with her hands in her lap, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has moved past the point where emotion is the primary response and arrived at the point where decision is. Robert is already on the foundation complaint, Eleanor said. He traced the filing address to Stamford, Connecticut. Diane's eyes narrowed. Greg Paulson lives in Stamford. Yes. Marcus's college friend, who borrowed $12,000 from him in 2019. The same. Diane was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? She said. Tomorrow morning, Eleanor said, I need you to come to a meeting with Robert. There is someone I want you to hear from. Alan Mercer was 43 years old, perpetually slightly rumpled, and had brought a granola bar to the meeting, which he ate quietly in the corner while waiting for everyone to settle. He was, as Robert had described him, the most thorough, reluctant whistleblower anyone in the room had encountered. He had a folder. The folder was organized with color-coded tabs. The color-coding system had a legend on the inside front cover. I want to start, he said carefully, by saying that I am aware this situation is going to attract some media attention, and I would appreciate if my name could be kept as private as possible for as long as possible, because my mother watches the evening news every night, and she does not know about any of this, and I would prefer she learn about it from me rather than from the television. Diane looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Diane. We will do everything we can, Eleanor said. Thank you. He opened the folder to the first color-coded section. Okay. So, I started keeping records in March of last year, when Mr. Callahan first asked me to process what he described as a bridge transfer through the Hargrove account structure. He walked them through it methodically. Transaction records, email authorization chains, a handwritten log in his personal notebook, dated and detailed, recording every conversation he had been part of. And most significantly, 18 audio recordings made on his personal phone over 8 months, capturing Marcus, giving explicit verbal instructions about how to document and obscure the transfers. The recordings were clear. The voice was unambiguously Marcus. The instructions were unambiguous. By the time Alan finished, the room was very quiet. Mr. Mercer, Robert said, you collected this evidence over 8 months while continuing to work at the firm. Yes. That required considerable nerve. Alan looked slightly uncomfortable. It required considerable anxiety, mostly. I have a very good doctor. We talked about it a lot. Eleanor leaned forward. Why didn't you come forward sooner? He met her eyes. Because I had no one safe to come forward to. Victoria Weston's name was on everything. I didn't know whose side anyone was on. I didn't know who was complicit and who wasn't. He paused. When the ownership of the firm changed, when I found out there was a new anonymous parent company with an actual compliance structure and a legal team that was actively auditing the books, I called your attorney within 48 hours. You were waiting for safety, Eleanor said. Yes. She nodded slowly. You have it now, she said. Robert filed with the SEC that afternoon. The revised submission included Allen's recordings, his transaction logs, his written records, and the complete audit findings from all three ECH Holdings firms. It also included, as Exhibit 7, a preliminary forensic accounting report demonstrating that the shell account Marcus had used predated his employment at Weston Industries by 6 months, and that the original co-signatory on the account was one Gregory Paulson of Stamford, Connecticut. Greg Paulson, when contacted by federal investigators the following morning, retained a lawyer within 2 hours, which was, Robert observed, the behavior of a man who had been expecting this call for some time. The foundation complaint, now traceable to Greg's forwarding address, was formally dismissed with prejudice. The children's summer program was reinstated by end of week. Diane appeared at Eleanor's door that evening with the bottle of wine she had been saving. Now? She said. Eleanor accepted a glass. Now, she said. They sat on the back porch in the November cold with blankets and wine and the particular companionship of two people who have been through something and come out the other side. Are you scared about the hearing? Diane asked. Yes. Good. It means you understand the stakes. Eleanor looked out at the dark yard. The trail behind the house was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. I got a call from the hospital today, she said. Routine cardiac follow-up from my admission. They found something on the overnight monitor readings they want to look at more closely. Diane went still. What kind of something? Probably nothing, but the appointment is tomorrow morning. The hearing is tomorrow morning. Yes. Silence. Eleanor? I know. Diane reached over and took her hand. They sat like that for a while, not talking, in the quiet dark of the November yard, and Eleanor thought about her father, who had built a $500 million fortune without making noise about it, who had told her that the right kind of strength is the kind that holds when it is most expensive to hold. She thought about the heart monitor in the hospital room. She thought about the automatic doors sliding shut. She thought about 18 children in small chairs with paintbrushes. Whatever the test shows, she said, I am going to that hearing. Diane squeezed her hand. Obviously, she said. I'll drive. The cardiac follow-up showed a minor arrhythmia, consistent with acute stress response, manageable and not dangerous, requiring only monitoring and, in the doctor's careful phrasing, a significant reduction in sources of ongoing stress. Eleanor thanked the doctor, agreed to the monitoring, and arrived at the federal courthouse at 9:15. The courtroom was full. Reporters occupied the back rows. Attorneys clustered at both tables with the organized intensity of people who have prepared extensively and are now in the part of the process where preparation meets reality. Several of Weston Industries' board members occupied seats in the gallery with expressions ranging from grim to openly anxious. Eleanor walked to the plaintiff's table and sat down beside Robert. At the opposing table, Marcus sat with his attorney, a sharp and expensive man from a firm in New York that specialized in corporate defense. Marcus's suit was good. His posture was controlled. He was doing an excellent impression of a man who was not afraid. Victoria Weston was not present. She had submitted a deposition. Marcus looked at Eleanor once, briefly, with an expression she recognized as the last version of the expression she had seen on his face in the early years. The one that meant he was aware he had miscalculated and was trying to assess the damage. She did not look away from the front of the room. The judge entered. The proceedings began. Marcus's attorney made the counter-motion argument crisply and with professional confidence. ECH Holdings had acquired the partner firm specifically to gain access to internal documents, constituting targeted market manipulation designed to manufacture admissible evidence. The acquisitions were improper. The evidence was fruit of a poisoned process. The case should be dismissed. Robert stood. He presented ECH Holdings acquisition filings, all publicly registered, all legally compliant, all independently audited, and time-stamped before any evidence was formally obtained. He presented Alan Mercer's recordings, with documentation confirming that they had been made on Mercer's personal device beginning 8 months prior to any ECH Holdings acquisition. He presented the forensic accounting report on the Shell account and its pre-existing registration. Then he said, "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit 14, a deposition from Victoria Weston." The room shifted. Victoria appeared on the screen at the front of the courtroom, seated in a conference room, composed and unadorned. She spoke for 11 minutes. She confirmed that Marcus had introduced the Shell account strategy to her as a compliance management tool. She confirmed that she had signed early documents in good faith. She confirmed that she had discovered, upon reviewing the SEC filing, a document bearing her signature that she had never seen and never authorized. She confirmed, in clear and specific language, that Marcus had forged her name on the document authorizing the largest and most clearly fraudulent transfer. The courtroom was very quiet. Marcus's attorney leaned to his client. A rapid, urgent, whispered exchange. Marcus's face had gone the color of old paper. The judge reviewed the deposition transcript, the forensic document analysis confirming the forgery, and the exhibit package Robert had submitted. He looked at Marcus for a long moment. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I am denying the counter-motion. The acquisitions were legally executed and the evidence is admissible in its entirety. Furthermore, given the testimony regarding document forgery, this court is referring that specific matter to the federal prosecutor's office for independent review." He set down his glasses. "I would strongly recommend that you and your counsel use the recess productively." The gavel came down. The room erupted. Eleanor sat very still. Robert touched her arm lightly. "It is done," he said, quietly. She nodded. She did not feel triumph exactly. She felt the particular exhaustion that follows a long period of sustained precision, the release of energy that has been held carefully for a very long time. She felt, underneath that, something quieter, something that might, eventually, become peace. In the chaos of the recess, Marcus moved toward her. His attorney tried to intercept him, but he kept walking, and he stopped 2 feet away from her with the expression of a man who has run out of performance and has only the actual thing left. "Ellie," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't know about the money," he said. His voice was rough. "I want you to know that. I didn't leave because of money. I know." "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" "Because you did," she said. "Not because of me, because of the choices you made before you even met Victoria. The Shell account existed before you started working for her, Marcus. You were already planning your exit when you were still coming home to Sunday dinners." He was quiet. "You thought I was soft enough to walk over," she said. "You thought patience was the same as weakness. You thought I would take the settlement and go quiet. I was wrong. Yes. Ellie, I am..." I have something for you. She reached into her bag and produced a sealed envelope. Give this to your grandfather. It's a check for his outstanding medical bills. They were routed to our shared address by mistake, and I paid them. Marcus stared at her. Why would you do that? Because Thomas is a good man, and because I am not you. She turned and walked toward the exit, where Diane was waiting. Diane had brought terrible gas station coffee in styrofoam cups and was holding one out as Eleanor came through the doors. Well, she said. It's over, Eleanor said. Diane handed her the coffee. The good wine tonight, she said. Definitely the good wine tonight. 6 months later, the Harris Art and Hope Foundation's annual gala was held on a Friday evening in April in a renovated warehouse space in New Haven that Eleanor had secured through a donation she described in the foundation's materials as an anonymous gift from a legacy trust, which was accurate and also satisfying. The room was full of light, crystal fixtures, white tablecloths, the particular warmth of a gathering of people who are there because they care about the thing being celebrated rather than because they need to be seen caring about it. Eleanor stood near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, wearing a simple white dress, her hair down for the first time in what felt like years. Diane was beside her in emerald green, holding a glass of the good wine, pretending she was not crying and not succeeding. Grandpa Thomas was in the front row in a bow tie that was slightly crooked, which Eleanor had gently attempted to straighten and which he had gently resisted, on the grounds that he had tied his own bow ties for 50 years and was not about to stop now. He had brought his sister. His sister had brought a camera. The camera had been producing a remarkable number of photographs for the past 40 minutes. Alan Mercer was there with his mother, a small, cheerful woman named Evelyn, who had indeed seen her son on the evening news and had called him immediately, not, as it turned out, to express concern, but to ask if she could tell her book club. Alan had said yes. Evelyn Mercer was currently telling everyone she met that her son was a hero, a characterization that made Alan visibly uncomfortable and which Diane had decided was the most endearing thing she had witnessed in recent memory. Robert Whitfield stood slightly apart from the crowd, as he typically did at social events, watching the room with the quiet attention of a man who finds people professionally interesting. When Eleanor caught his eye, he raised his glass. She raised hers in return. The settlement had been finalized 2 weeks earlier. Weston Industries, under new leadership following the board's decision to accept Victoria's resignation and rebuild the executive structure, had entered into a civil agreement with ECH Holdings. The terms were not public, but the outcome was a substantial fund, drawn from the settlement, had been designated for the Foundation's programs and for a new initiative supporting workers displaced by corporate fraud investigations. Marcus had accepted a plea agreement in the federal matter. 30 months, suspended pending full restitution and community service, with the forgery charge added to the financial fraud. His attorney had negotiated competently, and Marcus had cooperated fully, which Robert assessed as the behavior of a man who had finally understood that cooperation was the only remaining currency he had. Victoria Weston had sent flowers to the gala. White roses, no card. Eleanor had put them on the table where the children painted. Outside the tall windows, the April evening was settling into dark blue, the garden below lit with small lights that Diane had spent an afternoon arranging with intense, personal investment. A young woman named Samantha, 29, one of the Foundation's first recipients of the new Displaced Workers Program, touched Eleanor's arm. Mrs. Callahan, I wanted to say thank you, properly I mean, not in an email. Eleanor turned to her. Because of this place, Samantha said, I found work again. I found out I was good at something I didn't know I was good at. She smiled, slightly embarrassed by her own sincerity. I found myself again, I guess. Eleanor smiled back. You did that? We just reminded you that your story wasn't finished. Samantha laughed softly and moved back into the crowd. Eleanor stood at the window alone for a moment. She reached into her small bag and took out two things. Her father's old watch, the one she had kept from the study safe, worn and smooth and warm in her hand, and Marcus's wedding ring, which she had kept not out of sentiment, but because she had not been ready, until now, to decide what it meant to let it go. She held both in her hands for a moment, the watch she put back in her bag, the ring she set gently on the windowsill. She looked at it for a moment, a plain gold band in the light of an April evening. Then she left it there and turned back toward the room. Diane appeared at her elbow, refilling her wine with the focused authority of someone who has decided the evening requires attention. Thomas's bow tie has gotten worse, Diane observed. I think he did something to it. He's had it for 50 years. It shows. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the room, watching Grandpa Thomas, now in animated conversation with Alan's mother, watching the children who had been brought in for a brief exhibition of their work, moving carefully between the adults with the particular pride of young people who have been told their work matters. Your father would have liked tonight, Diane said. Yes, Eleanor said. He would have. She looked out at the garden below, the small lights, the dark blue evening, the ordinary world going about its ordinary business. She thought about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the foundation growing, the programs expanding, the children who would paint things in this space that they could not yet imagine and would not have painted anywhere else. She thought about the safe in the study, which now held only old family photographs and a letter she had read 3 times and no longer needed to read again because she had lived it. She thought about her father, who had spent his career being patient in rooms where patience was not the expected behavior, who had built something extraordinary by moving slowly and carefully and without announcement. She thought about what he had said. Power doesn't shout, Elena. It whispers, and the world listens. She had learned that, differently than he had taught it, through different rooms and different documents, but she had learned it. The toastmaster called the room to attention. Eleanor set down her wine glass and turned to face her guests. In the back of the room, near the door, she noticed Grandpa Thomas had finally surrendered his bow tie to Evelyn Mercer, who was retying it with the decisive competence of a woman who had been managing bow ties for decades. Thomas stood patiently with his chin up, looking dignified about the whole thing. Eleanor smiled. She stepped to the front of the room. She was not going to give the speech she had written. She had written a careful speech about the Foundation's mission and the year ahead and the importance of what they were building together. And it was a good speech, well organized, and she was not going to give it. Instead, she said, "My father used to say that the truest measure of a person is what they choose to build after something breaks." He wasn't talking about money or success. He was talking about the decision you make on the quiet morning after the worst thing, when you can either grieve permanently or build deliberately. Both are valid, but only one of them moves you forward. She looked around the room, at Diane, at Thomas, at Samantha, at Alan, who was making eye contact with his mother in a way that suggested she had just said something about the book club again. This foundation exists because of a broken thing, Eleanor said. And because I had a father who taught me that broken things are just materials. She raised her glass. To what we build next. The room raised their glasses. Later, after the guests had gone and the lights were being dimmed, and Diane had helped Thomas find his coat, and Evelyn Mercer had produced a card for everyone she had spoken to and insisted on contact information for the newsletter, Eleanor walked back to the window. The ring was still on the windowsill. She picked it up one last time. Then she placed it in the small dish near the door where people left their name tags. Ordinary and unremarkable, among other small discarded things. She put on her coat. She turned off the light. She walked out into the April night, which was cool and clean and full of the particular promise that April nights have, the feeling that something has ended and something else is just beginning, and the distance between the two is exactly the right size. She had a father who loved her. She had a friend who had sat on a kitchen floor with her at 2 a.m. and stayed. She had 18 children who came back every week to make things. She had $512 million that she was using carefully and without announcement. She had her health monitored and improving. She had, most importantly, the specific and irreplaceable knowledge of exactly who she was. Marcus Callahan had walked out of a hospital room thinking he had left behind a soft, manageable woman who would accept what she was given. What he had actually left behind was the one person who had always known what she was worth. She just had not been ready until he left to prove it. She had been proving it ever since. The night was quiet around her as she walked to her car. She did not look back. She did not need to. Some endings do not need revenge. They only need truth and patience and the right kind of quiet. Closing disclaimer: the content of this story, including its narrative, characters, emotional arc, and thematic structure, was researched, developed, and manually edited by our team with the sole purpose of bringing you meaning, perspective, and stories worth your time. We believe that the right story, told with care, can remind people of what they are capable of. Thank you for being here.